al vento muta d'accento e di pensiero sempre un amabile leggiadro viso.
But Verdi's success wasn't just down to canny marketing. With nearly 20 years of opera writing under his belt, what Verdi called his galley years, he confirmed his reputation as a radical and revolutionary man of the theatre with his 18th opera, Rigoletto, premiered in 1851 in the famous La Fenice Theatre in Venice.
It was an overnight sensation here, and I think the very strong reason for that is that the drama is a very claustrophobic kind of love triangle, full of rumour and suspicion and intrigue, all of which are things which speak directly and absolutely to Venetians. After all, there's an awful lot of them crammed into a very, very small space, over 100,000 in fact, in a tiny collection of small islands.
That intimacy of La Fenice is something which seemed to come across in Rigoletto itself. It's an opera which doesn't have huge choruses in it, but it has a lot of very tight, very intense family dramas. You can almost imagine that in some ways he was composing it for a smaller theatre where he could rely on those kinds of effects.
La Fenice, for composers like Verdi, the epitome of the power and glamour of opera, right here in the heart of Venice. Well, as you can see, it's pretty much a building site at the moment. Through its history, the theatre's been victim of two fires, one in the 19th century and most recently in 1996. There are dark murmurings of alleged mafia involvement, which tell you a lot about the way that Venice operates. So often things aren't quite what they seem. You get these beautiful, glittering facades, but a sense that they conceal a rather seamier, darker underbelly.
Anyone who's been to Venice will know it's full of beautiful sights and you can see the most romantic kind of scenery. But anyone who's been there when the tide's in knows that there's a lot of nasty things floating around underneath. Well, in a sense, you could say Rigoletto is like that. It has this surface of the court and beautiful, elegant surroundings, but then it's very obvious from the beginning that there's something rather nasty fueling the drama. So we have a beautiful court scene with grandiose banquet going on, all sorts of extravagant public display. Rigoletto is there, he's playing this public figure, and then he goes out of that, and immediately you see him in the seamier side of the city. You see he has a dark and threatening conversation with an assassin. He begins to plan private revenge. So there's a sudden and very obvious juxtaposition of those two spaces.
But Verdi was on dangerous ground. In the heated atmosphere of post-revolutionary Venice, the censors found his vision of the world not to their taste. While the opera may have been set way back in the past, in 16th century Mantua, there was no doubt that Rigoletto posed difficult questions about the nature of power and the ability of rulers to govern the people. Director David McVicker.
We tried to encapsulate in the design of Rigoletto the entire world in which these people live. Unusually for Rigoletto, we have decided to play the entire piece on one set, in one environment. And what we've tried to do is sum up a world, the world of luxury, the world of the Duke, this incredibly fragile glass palace, which is shored up and supported by this dense, dark, stinking Dickensian world where Rigoletto, Sparafucil, the have-nots live, and where they, like dung beetles, feed off the almost like the excrement of the rich classes, of the people in power. Even though we are in the Duke's world, we see that this structure is collapsing and we see what is shoring it up.
But it wasn't just Verdi's picture of a sometimes ugly world that so upset the censors.
Perhaps the supremely radical thing about Rigoletto is that up to 1850, on the operatic stage and also on the theatrical stage, characters were essentially what they appeared to be. So a foul and deformed hunchback was exactly that, foul, evil, depraved, deformed inside. Equally, the Duke, this tall, athletic, Adonis-like man, would ultimately have been the hero. But what Verdi does is to turn that completely on its head, so that Rigoletto, this outwardly ugly and very unfortunate soul, is actually deep down inside, or at least proves himself to be, very pure and full of goodness. The Duke, on the other hand, tall, as I say, athletic, Adonis-like, very attractive, ultimately is the foul philanderer.
Similarly, with Gilda, Rigoletto's daughter, we see a woman who in many ways breaks out of the operatic stereotype, taking her destiny into her own hands. Cultural historian Elaine Showalter.
I think in 1850 the dominant image is the woman in romantic captivity. And I think what happens in Rigoletto is really fascinating, because once she is forcibly taken out of her confinement and out of her infantilism, really, the place that her father's kept her penned up, Gilda grows up. Abruptly, she grows up sexually. She's sexually initiated. She grows up psychologically, but there's nowhere to go in that world. There's nowhere for a woman to go. She can be the whore. She could be the duchess, the absent duchess, but there's no real space for her to inhabit.
Certainly, Gilda is a woman who cannot survive in the society which Verdi presents in Rigoletto. She cannot exist. She can exist, certainly, locked up in that house, as Rigoletto wants her to be locked up, without experience, but her development as a human being will be so stunted. Once she tastes experience, her destruction is inevitable. And it's one of the most pessimistic themes of Rigoletto, that experience inevitably leads to corruption, inevitably leads to a downfall, inevitably leads to an exit from Eden.
I think ultimately the thing for me that's amazing about Verdi is that he knew how to write such great tunes and yet at the same time to take his audience so much further. All those people that must have been fighting for tickets to La Fenice for the first performance of Rigoletto just to see what great new tunes Maestro Verdi had come out with. But at the same time, he was showing them things which to them would have been so shocking and disturbing as well as delightful. And everything that I've seen so far in the rehearsals of this production at Covent Garden shows to me that this same sense of shock and delight is going to be engendered upon the audience here in just the same way that the La Fenice audience must have experienced it back then in 1851.
I'm not interested in merely serving the piece in a cosmetic sense, in the way that a rich Californian lady has a facelift. I'm not interested in just putting a new face on it. I'm interested in investigating the skeleton of the piece, investigating the bowels of the piece, investigating the energy of the piece, what drove the composer, whoever Verdi, to create this piece. What was he trying to say? What was he angry about? What did he want the audience to feel? Human beings have not changed. The way that we relate to each other within a society is constant, and that is what Verdi is talking about.
There's absolutely no doubt that Rigoletto is a tremendously important opera in Verdi's career. It was written 150 years ago now, but it's the first of his operas which has never dropped out of the repertory. It was a huge success when it was first performed, and it's remained in the repertory of the world's greatest opera houses ever since. There are hardly any other operas that have managed to do that.
It is extraordinary when you actually look at the list of what we now consider the great classic operas that are the backbone of every opera house in the world, that nearly all of them had an incredibly rough ride, both from the critics and the public. I think, funnily enough, Rigoletto is one of the few operas that actually was embraced by the public at the beginning.
My hope is always, if someone has not seen Rigoletto before, they will come and they will understand with total clarity what Verdi is trying to say through the piece. And I hope if you have seen Rigoletto 13 times, you will come away thinking, wow, I never realised it was such a good opera. That's what I want.